Ancient Rome, the cradle of modern civilization. Not those medieval clowns believing in magic and seriously studying astrology, but Rome itself, with its organized army that conquered 3 continents and its state system that held it all together. Everything was born there. Modern countries are more like Rome, not some medieval Neapolitan republic circus. No wonder the world borrowed its entertainment from there. Even if you don't follow the no-holds-barred UFC fights, you sure know about their existence. But how would UFC look according to Rome? Much more epic, deadly, and grandiose. Today, we'll immerse ourselves in that atmosphere and live a day as a real damn gladiator. Meet Joao Felix, a simple mid-tier gladiator training in Rome's barracks not far from the legendary Colosseum. You're probably surprised by his name. After all, it's the year 185, and from our video about legionaries, you know that Roman names were specific. And that's absolutely true. On the throne sits Emperor Lucius Aurelius Camod, and Rome's traditions of name formation still hold. Our gladiator's name is Joao Felix because he's a slave, and slaves aren't entitled to names. Funny fact, legally, slaves were the children of their owners, just utterly powerless ones, and few cared about names. Sometimes they were only given nicknames, like first or third. Sometimes a slave was called boy or lad, but most of the time, the slave was just allowed to keep the name they had when they were free. Our Joao ended up in slavery somewhere in Spain, and his owner didn't bother and let him keep his name. Well, Felix is a nickname, which means lucky. Slaves rarely received nicknames, usually for some merit. In Joao's case, it's straightforward. He's a decent gladiator and has already made money for his owner. That's why he got the nickname Lucky. As you may have guessed, slaves constituted the vast majority of gladiators, but it's not like they were against it. Gladiators were well-fed, trained, and exempted from any other work. And though initially, they were forced onto the arena. Later, there was a queue of volunteers. Not just slaves, criminals and prisoners of war also became gladiators instead of being sent to prison, and sometimes even free citizens, often quite wealthy ones. After all, there was another thing that the modern world inherited from Rome: betting. Before the battles, the arenas were covered in posters of fighters, announcements of loud clashes, and offers to bet on the battle's outcome. Gladiators were surrounded by insane amounts of money, and for Joao's owner, he could be the most valuable asset, provided that he's a good gladiator. Of course, the tradition of Roman battles itself was also borrowed from ancestors. Ancient Etruscans performed sacrifices following a specific principle. A group of people gathered, everyone was given weapons, and they fought to the death. The deceased was considered a sacrifice, and the survivor was marked by the gods. They were left alive and revered in every way. Clever Romans realized that people loved this idea and turned the battles into profitable festivals of worshiping the god of war, Mars. In 105 BC, gladiator fights were officially named public spectacles and were conducted with the support of the state, so becoming a gladiator was quite prestigious. To secure the position, Joao purposely got into a fight with other slaves. That's how the owner noticed that Joao was good with his hands and sent him to the gladiator school. The school itself is a peculiar place. Upon enrollment, Joao took a real oath. The essence of it was that a person legally declared themselves dead, and the owner couldn't take them to court about the gladiator's death anymore. Joao also obeyed the harsh code of the profession. Firstly, a gladiator must remain silent during the fight. In the arena, the guys communicated through gestures. Secondly, there's a ban on cowardice. A defeated gladiator must remove his helmet and look at the audience to prove that he has not a shred of fear in his eyes and is ready to die. Thirdly, there was the law of honor. Gladiators avoided dirty tricks and, when defeated, they willingly exposed their necks to the opponent's sword. And in extreme cases, they had to kill themselves. So, what is Felix fighting for anyway? Obviously, the gladiator's life is short. In a week, he could take part in 7 battles. But let's not forget that in regular life, an owner could kill a slave just out of boredom. Times were quite harsh, and life was worth very little. So Felix chose the life of a warrior. After all, he had a personal doctor, chef, and trainer, and his owner would kill anyone who offended his precious gladiator. And there was also the rudes ahead. It's a wooden sword that granted freedom to a gladiator. They were given to only a few to maintain the illusion of hope. But still, they were given. More often than not, it was due to the insane love of the public or a high-ranking official. Emperors almost gave rudices at every battle they attended to appear merciful and gain popularity among the people. The daily routine of a gladiator is simple as pie. Our Felix lives in a tiny room of 6 square meters. To strengthen muscles, gladiators constantly used weapons and armor twice as heavy as those used in combat. Early rising, breakfast, exercises with the trainer, and so on endlessly until the day of battles arrives. Initially, such days were associated with holidays, the ascension of emperors to the throne, and other memorable events. But at the beginning of our era, gladiator fights themselves became the holiday. That very Gaius Julius Caesar in 65 BCE realized what's what and held huge games with 320 battles. Romans went crazy over such spectacles, and Caesar received extraordinary support and votes in the elections. After all, the modern analogy to Rome's games is not UFC but rather wrestling. Gladiator fights were precisely planned by a special person. His name was the editor, and the editor was in charge of everything. Before the battles, there were often theatrical performances, musicians playing, and people entertaining as best they could. Then the gladiators were led onto the arena, and they uttered the famous phrase Ave Caesar moritur et saludant, which translates to Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. A demonstration fight about Lucius was held, in which participants used wooden weapons to simulate a battle with musical accompaniment. After that, they brought out the gladiators who refused to fight and publicly beat and punished them, and only then did the real matches begin. Everything's analogous to modern times. The newcomers performed first, and the juicy fights were saved for the end. There were millions of types of fights, and people weren't allowed to fight just anybody. The Romans had a clear system where each class of fighter wore specific equipment. Bestiarii gladiators fought against animals and were considered the lowest caste. Hoplomachus gladiators imitated Greek hoplites, Galli used spears, and Democharis wielded two sabers. There are about 26 different types of gladiators, all to keep people from getting bored. Crossovers with battles of different classes were often arranged. The audience loved watching foot soldiers trying to kill horsemen. Our Felix is a classic Myrmidon gladiator. These guys wore a helmet with the image of a fish mormor and were the most common. It's them that movies often depict. Half-naked guys with minimal gear, a small shield, and a standard gladius sword. Myrmidons were sent against everyone, and statistics say that they handled even heavily armed Thracians quite well. Regarding the fights themselves, there are plenty of misconceptions. Our Felix isn't cannon fodder, and Roman fights aren't a wild revelry. There was a jury behind each battle, the so-called summer rudies. They were former gladiators who had been granted freedom. The guys would note unfair hits, moves, and could either disqualify or reward a fighter. The expert commission often suggested giving rudizes, and our Felix knows this all too well. So, he, like other good gladiators, tries to fight fairly and win the favor of the judges. The judges, in turn, could stop the fight, and there were cases when the seemingly victorious gladiator was declared the loser due to a rule violation. This is where it gets interesting. You must know that the fate of the defeated was decided by the public. If our Felix doesn't succeed, then according to the code, he must remove his helmet and await his fate. The ruler would decide it based on the public's opinion, and the public voted with famous gestures, which, unfortunately, are often misinterpreted. A fist with the thumb sticking out always meant the same thing. It didn't matter if the thumb was pointed down or up. For the gladiator, it meant death. After all, the thumb symbolized a sword, and the downward pointing thumb of a clenched fist meant an old-fashioned negative gesture. It symbolized a sword thrusting into someone's throat from above. To spare a gladiator, a fist with the thumb hidden inside was used, symbolizing a sheathed sword. It's worth noting that the percentage of pardons was low. More often than not, they were favorites of the public or well-known gladiators belonging to noble lords. But it was the people who made the decision. Rulers weren't idiots to oppose the will of the common workers. Revolts were a common occurrence, and to execute a gladiator loved by the public was akin to a death sentence for the emperor himself. There are a couple more myths related to our Joe Felix's profession. Any movie or book loves to describe gladiators as powerful, invincible bodybuilders. In reality, it's not like that. A couple of months before the start of the fighting season, Felix and his colleagues filled themselves with fatty food as much as they could. The reason is clear. Thick skin and fatty layers could protect them from a dagger accidentally hitting in the wrong place. Bodybuilders were few among gladiators. It was much more important to protect the internal organs, even with a little fat. Another amusing fact, their work. Our Felix, besides being a gladiator, also works as a guard. Gladiator owners, on days free from battles, prefer to move around the city accompanied by their fighters, and sometimes, after training, they exempted them from deadly fights and assigned them to serve as guards forever. But even this doesn't allow calling a gladiator's life sweet, since at least every third fighter didn't survive until the end of the next games. There were grievances, often resulting in revolts. The most famous revolt was that of the gladiator Spartacus, who gathered dissatisfied individuals and quite successfully gave battles to the regular Roman army. The trouble was that even though they were skilled warriors, gladiators had little sense of tactics and strategy, so the overwhelming majority of uprisings were suppressed. conquest, and the games continued throughout the Empire's territory. Besides the legendary Colosseum, other arenas of battles have reached our days. The Pula Amphitheater in Croatia is considered the best preserved example. There's the Arena of Verona, the Lutetia Arena, and even the amphitheater of Marcus Antonius Gordianus in Tunisia. The territory of the Roman Empire was vast, and people everywhere loved gladiator fights. Would you like to witness such a spectacle? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and, of course, don't forget to hit the like button under the video. Let his thumb be extended. In our time, this gesture isn't so severe.